The Salvation Army has traditionally been involved in human suffering in a variety of degrees. From the early days in East London, our founders, William and Catherine Booth, back in 1865, not only identified very specific needs that related to people that were either living in the streets or living under very difficult conditions, but they also recognized that simply giving them temporary solutions to their problems were not going to change their lives. They needed something that was going to instill a longer lasting hope. They needed to make sure that their ministry, their expressions of love and grace done in Jesus' name, were going to make that eternal impact. So even back in the early days, the Booths decided that they needed to find some practical way to go about rescuing individuals, somehow being able to take them out of their current conditions, to be able to transform those situations into something that might be able to instill greater hope and sustenance for the future. Those at the time translated into being able to rescue prostitutes, being able to rescue those who were entrapped in child labor, those who were also victims of their own choices, their own addictions, but yet didn't know how to get out of them themselves. Nationally and internationally, the Salvation Army has recognized that one of the most chronic problems facing us today are the modern-day slavery conditions that are found in sex trafficking. Today, there's over 600,000 to 700,000 men, women, and children who are victims of sex trafficking throughout the world that are often transferred across state or international boundaries and are hopelessly entrapped into a lifestyle that is neither of their choosing and certainly one that doesn't offer them an easy way out. The Salvation Army wants to become a leader in making sure that not only we bring a level of awareness to the communities that are being affected by this, but that we are as practical as we ever were in being able to reach out to those who are victims of this modern-day slavery. We're able to do that in a variety of ways. Again, community awareness is probably one of the most important things for us to recognize that this isn't a problem that is simply found on the news, that is in some other place in the world far away from us. But unfortunately, in many of our communities, large, small, urban, or rural, there are thousands of individuals who are caught in sex trafficking or some type of sexual exploitation. Right here in Chicago, for example, we know that there are virtually tens of thousands of children who are either being abused emotionally or sexually, and much of that relates to the sex industry. They are victims, again, which by their own admission, by their own understanding, have never known any other type of lifestyle. There are some that believe that they were either going to be given a better life or some position of employment or some opportunity that they wouldn't have had under normal conditions. And because they were either desperate or because someone else has talked them into it, someone else has perhaps even recruited them into this, they suddenly found themselves without options. They found themselves working under conditions where, again, they are certainly not making the choice to do so, but they have no hope of ever getting out. Right here in Chicago, we've got a very interesting program, something that is fairly unique when it comes to the United States. It is a long-term residential program that relates to those who have been traumatized through sexual exploitation. It's called Ann's House. Ann's House is prepared to serve young girls and children between the ages of 12 and 21 who have been part of the sex industry, again, through no choices of their own, but suddenly have found themselves victimized, that the Salvation Army is now reaching out to. They've been referred to the Salvation Army for long-term therapeutic care, to be able to provide a stable residential program, to make sure that they are somehow reintegrated into what we might consider to be a more normal life for children and teenagers, and are given hope of a better future, something that will relate to perhaps them discovering where their own gifts, where their own potential is, that they are no longer an object, they are no longer a victim, but they're actually beginning to realize that they have inherent value, that there's a God who not only loves and cares about them, but there's a very real sense of understanding what freedom and what rescue and what redemption are really all about. When the Salvation Army is able to rescue some of these young women, we are not only able to work with trained therapists, with caseworkers, with individuals who will provide that legal protection to make sure that they have an absolutely safe environment, but there will be a support structure working with, ideally, someone that might either be a parent or a guardian or a responsible adult who is charged with caring for them to make sure that their life is not only more stable, but certainly filled with opportunities that they never had before. Part of the real challenge that we face in the Salvation Army is that the estimated numbers of children who are physically and sexually abused by the sex industry in the United States range between 250,000 and 325,000 today. Ann's House here in Chicago is only able to care for 8 at a time. There's no other residential care program in the United States that offers the same level of care and the same extent of long-term housing the way Ann's House does. So when you do the math, you realize there are tens, even hundreds of thousands of victims that aren't being cared for. Those 8 that are able to be provided, that long-lasting level of care, are carefully screened and referred by other, whether it be medical experts or those in the law enforcement, whether they be policemen or sheriffs or others that have been involved with virtually rescuing them and shutting down that sex trade operation. But they're given that opportunity of making sure that, first of all, they're not going to do harm to themselves or to someone else living in Ann's House, that they are not suicidal at this point. And unfortunately, many of those children have reached a level of depression and absolute desperation that they have gone into more severe psychological problems, whether that be writing on themselves or cutting or some of the other psychological self-destructive behaviors. We also need to make sure that their choices, that their decisions are not going to provide any greater risk to those that they are living with. So once that girl or that young lady is selected and brought to the Salvation Army and referred, we make sure that the services provided to her are absolutely customized, whether that be for specific psychological assessments or for the spiritual support, to make sure that she understands, once again, that there is a greater power, a source that not only created her, but makes certain that there is something far more valuable within her and her future. And to be able to guide her in academic means, to be able to get her into schooling once again so that she can learn things, whether they be practical skills or the academic basics that any child should be able to learn. And so all of those are customized, specific to the needs of those young ladies. And it's amazing to see the level of transformation that has already begun to occur. Ann's House has only been open since September of 2010, and there have been a number of young ladies that have already gone through the program, some that are still there, some that will need that long-term extended type support. But to be able to see them emerge from what they once were, to be able to discover that from the shell that they were building around themselves to protect themselves, to be able to survive under inhumane, unbelievable kind of conditions, they are now blossoming into the kind of young ladies that God has always designed them to be. There's a sense of inner beauty that is beginning to develop. The Salvation Army is part now of a coalition, a partnership, what we call the Promise Program, the partnership to rescue our minors caught in sexual exploitation. And within that coalition are individuals that are not only the experts, but they are able to come alongside of us in being able to educate other care providers who don't have that same level of expertise. Over 10,000 individuals have been trained in the last 5 years under the curriculum that has been developed through the Promise program. That curriculum is not only training nurses or medical professionals, but also those who are involved in law enforcement, to be able to identify some potential risks and issues and elements that might be symptomatic of a child who is actually caught in the sex trafficking industry. There may not be individuals who are always kept behind locked doors, or those who are always being physically and emotionally abused, but they may be part of a family structure where they haven't known anything else, but they're still brought to maybe a family physician, or they're still brought to the emergency room when a crisis might develop. So it's important that we have those trained professionals be able to identify some of those symptoms of abuse so that we can work very closely with them. Part of the strengths, I believe, of the Salvation Army outreach is to be able to not only make sure that the level of compassion and sacrifice within our staff and our volunteers emulates what we preach and teach about God's grace and forgiveness and redemption and spiritual freedom, but that there's the opportunity for us to be able to lay that out every day, whether it be in encouraging the young girls to be able to get into God's Word, to discover more about the truth, about God's love, about His purpose for each one of us, for the price that He has paid through His Son, Jesus Christ, so that we might truly and eternally be free. But there's also the opportunity of being able to match those young girls up with existing Salvation Army programs and ministries, or perhaps even with their families, and perhaps if there's a church connection that might be a part of that, to make sure that that program and that ministry is going to continue even after they leave our direct care. The Salvation Army doesn't require that someone adheres to a statement of belief or subscribes to a certain set of doctrines before we provide any care. In fact, our care is offered without discrimination. We want to make sure that we're more than just a social service agency. We want to make sure that we're doing more than just providing that direct human service, but that we're truly agents, ambassadors of God's grace and love in the most practical ways possible. One of our success stories, as a case example, might be Vicky, who was a 13-year-old Asian girl. Vicky was adopted, and unfortunately, her adoptive mother died suddenly, and her father was not able to provide the same level or quality of care. So as he moved with Vicky into a family's home, unfortunately, Vicky became more and more independent, at times even rebellious. And she was certainly in a neglectful, if not an abusive situation already, but found that the only way that she could get attention is at times would be to respond to whatever others would ask her to do. And a lot of those were not only inappropriate behaviors, but things where, unfortunately, that's where her needs would be met. She would meet up with men, and they would take advantage of her. They would abuse her. She would be raped several times, and unfortunately became accustomed to that type of lifestyle. Even though she was still going to school every day, she was not held as captive, yet she had very difficult times building friendships with her peers. She would only spend time with boys and wouldn't really understand why others were beginning to shun her. She would write on herself, which is often symptomatic of deeper psychological scars that would be caused through cutting. And when the Salvation Army was made aware of Vicky's situation, we certainly welcomed her into Ann's house and began to integrate her into the program. And bit by bit, she began to discover that some of the behaviors that were reinforced and certainly abused and became a part of her psychological damage were being undone. The knots were being untied. The sense of freedom was beginning to be realized. And she began to really focus in, not only on her schoolwork, but began to realize that the girls around her were not a threat, but instead they were someone that could be trusted. And she now refers to them as her sisters, She's developing some very strong, some very solid and healthy relationships. She now knows what her personal boundaries need to be, both in her behavior as well as her talk. She's very cautious when she goes onto the internet now. She's dressing modestly. She's getting a sense of self-worth, of personal value. She's on the school honor roll right now, and we're excited because even though Vicki has lived a life that most people would never live to that degree, even twice her age, yet there's a whole lot more promise in her life. There's a whole lot more opportunity, and we're excited, and we're looking forward to what God has in store for Vicki. There are other situations like that. 16-year-old African-American girl who, again, has found herself victimized repeatedly, over and over and over. Her self-worth began to plummet, and the only way that she would get any kind of attention at all is by agreeing to do things that at first she found reprehensible, and now, unfortunately, were just a part of her own lifestyle. And again, the Salvation Army was able to undo some of those factors that were keeping her in that bondage. And for us to be able to see, to be able to look into the eyes, to be able to see and hear the stories, at times would be almost unbelievable. Not only what they've endured, but now how far they've been willing to come. And story by story, and we believe in the future, generation by generation are going to be affected by this kind of ministry, by this kind of hope. And even more so, it's exciting when I talk to our staff, when I hear about those victories, when I hear about girls that just can't wait at the end of the school year to rush home to Ann's house and to be able to brag about their report card and the grades that they're getting for the first time in their lives, and to be able to see the kind of enthusiasm that translates into a job well done. Some of our staff are working as full-time volunteers, sacrificing their time, their expertise, and investing it to make sure that the lives of these girls are going to have a tremendous and a very positive impact on the world surrounding them. For more information, there is details about Ann's house on our website, which is located at salarmychicago.org. But certainly we need the prayers of God's faithful, who not only need to pray for the awareness and the breaking down of the spiritual stronghold. The sexual trafficking industry is second in the world, along with illegal arms transaction, as being the most widespread criminal activity in the world, second only to drug trafficking. Yet we don't understand, and perhaps may not even realize, the numbers of people that are affected in our own communities. It's tragic when there are people who might say, well, that's a problem unique to Chicago, but it's not happening in my small rural community, only to discover that tragically there have been boys and girls and men and women who have been sexually abused or trafficked and are now being sold, being transferred. There are others involved in this industry where, as these victims are being moved from state to state to state, it's very difficult sometimes to even identify who they may be. There is almost an underground crime syndicate that is involved in making sure that these children are kept out of any type of a spotlight or cannot be recognized easily. And yet, in the same sense, we believe that through God's intervention, that these lives can not only be saved, but can be rescued and redeemed as well.